Good evening, everyone, and welcome. My name is Jocelyn Forbush. I'm the Chief Conservation Officer of Mass Audubon, and I want to thank you for joining us this evening to meet University of Massachusetts Assistant Professor Nate Senner and to learn more about Mass Audubon's evolving bird conservation strategy. We are excited to have more than 125 folks joining us on this very chilly night on Zoom. From across Massachusetts, from across the country, and even across, well beyond, across the pond. Before the presentation begins, though, I want to note just a couple things about this webinar, a few logistical details. First, it is being recorded, and we will share the recording link with all of you via email as soon as possible. Second, the chat function is turned off. But if you would like to ask a question, and we will have a Q&A period later on, please feel free to use the Q&A button that is at the bottom of your screen, and we will be collecting and consolidating questions for the Q&A period that follows the presentation. So I am pleased to introduce this evening's program and to introduce our new Gerard A. Bertrand Chair of Natural History and Field Ornithology here at Mass Audubon. And that is the University of Massachusetts Assistant Professor, Dr. Nathan Senner. Dr. Senner joins us in this endowed chair role, which was established to honor the career and really lifetime commitment of Mass Audubon's president, Jerry Bertrand, who led the organization from 1980 to 1998. So this chair role is really meant to embody the deep love of the natural world and especially bird life, and to ensure its preservation nationally and internationally, which is a cause that for those of you who know Jerry Bertrand, you know that he continues to pursue this work to this day. And I believe that Jerry is with us this evening. So just a wave and shout out to you and a thank you to Jerry. We're very pleased that you're here with us tonight. I'm really excited to introduce you all to Dr. Senner this evening. And you'll see very quickly in the presentation the potential for his work and for Mass Audubon's to really grow into an extremely impactful collaboration. Dr. Senner's lab focuses on understanding how organisms respond to environmental changes to help conserve threatened and endangered species. Most of his lab's research, you'll hear a great deal about it, involves long-distance migratory shorebirds, a collection of species that, as many of you know online tonight, are declining more rapidly than nearly any other group in the world. So tonight, we get to hear more about how Dr. Senner's lab's research really drives on-the-ground conservation action. In particular, I'm hopeful that he'll talk a little bit about his groundbreaking work to help protect the Hudsonian godwit, birds we'll see here on the Cape as they gear up for their epic trip to the Amazon River Basin and then to Argentina. So as Chief Conservation Officer, I'm really excited that Dr. Senner is in this role because his work will make such a significant difference in protecting the birds and the habitat they rely on in collaboration with Mass Audubon. So Dr. Senner really focuses on and wants his research to influence the policies, the conservation actions that we're mobilizing that really lead to the measurable and positive change for birds and the environment. Since joining Mass Audubon nearly a year ago, I've really been inspired by the work that we do in protecting migratory birds, especially the significant investment and care that we bring to our coastal waterbirds program. Our work is making a demonstrative difference in restoring shorebird populations, plovers, terns, and in fact, this past season, we saw another jump in our piping plover productivity rates here in Massachusetts, which tells us that the coastal habitats that we're stewarding are offering the critical habitat for a full suite of struggling shorebirds. But I have equally come to appreciate the power of birds in creating community and in mobilizing and motivating people to take action. Many of you were involved in the horseshoe crab campaign that was won by engaging motivated people who cared about the crabs and the birds that rely on their eggs. And our Rescuing Raptors campaign that is underway is currently changing the rules in towns across the Commonwealth to ensure that our raptors don't encounter fatal poisons. Like so many of you, I am inspired and awed, of course, by bird migration and how the emergence of new science, the use of technology to track birds and their journeys are really capturing the human spirit and really connecting us to people around the world. Our work at Mass Audubon today is building on a legacy of really successful efforts to partner, to inform, to engage in the conservation of Massachusetts birds throughout their life cycle. That means using what we have learned to protect birds in their wintering grounds, at stopover sites, and in other parts of their migration where they may be most vulnerable. We will always focus on Massachusetts, but we know that we have an obligation to use what we have learned and the resources we can develop to protect our birds throughout their life cycle. Dr. Senner and his team of scientists, working with John Herbert and our director of, who is our director of bird conservation, and our broader team are doing work together to do just that. We know that Mass Audubon has all the ingredients to build a movement to protect those birds who touch down here in Massachusetts, also those who call the Commonwealth their home. We have one of the most talented teams of nature-based educators, a brilliant network of sanctuaries and habitats, a grassroots community of activists, a community of grassroots activists willing to step up to defend nature, political leadership at state and federal levels, and now an exceptional academic partner in Dr. Nate Senner, joining our team of ecologists and ornithologists. We are excited to build a movement to protect birds and the habitats they rely on in this collaboration. So with that, I'll say a few words of introduction about Dr. Senner, and then we'll turn it over to him. So Dr. Senner is an assistant professor in UMass Amherst Department of Environmental Conservation, comes to us with an impressive array of honors, awards, fellowships, teaching roles, and prior to his role at UMass, held a post as an assistant professor at the University of South Carolina. Holds a BA from Carleton and a PhD from Cornell. I believe is sitting in Ithaca currently. But with that, I will hand it over and welcome Nate Senner to this evening's presentation. Thank you, Nate.
Thank you, Jocelyn. And thank you, everyone, for being here this evening. I'm truly, truly honored to assume this role as the Bertrand Chair and to have this opportunity to work with this fabulous team at Mass Audubon. To say that this is a dream come true is truly not an understatement on my part. So what I want to do tonight is to tell you a bit about the work that my lab does, how we think about conservation science, and yes, how we think about long-distance migratory shorebirds, but also a bit about the vision that I hope to share with the folks at Mass Audubon in order to make that movement that Jocelyn was mentioning possible. So the place that I want to start tonight is a place of hope. And that's by introducing you to this spot right here. And that's DeVoe Bank. It's a tiny sandbar sitting just off the shore of the most prestigious and golf course covered resort island in South Carolina, Kiowa. And what's remarkable and hopeful about DeVoe Bank is the fact that it can host sites like this. This is 20,000 whimbrel taking off after having spent the night sleeping on DeVoe during the midst of their northbound migration. And it's not just that this place can host this many birds, it's the fact that it actually remained completely unknown to us until a relatively short time ago. And so if there are places that hold this many birds that can remain so under our nose, yet so unknown, I'm hopeful that there are other places in the world that are likewise remaining to be discovered and that are going to bring us into a new frontier of how we think about bird conservation. And I think we also need that hope, though, because bad news is really never that far away. We honestly don't have to look any further than the story of Whimbrel themselves, because Whimbrel are one of a suite of 18 species of long-distance migratory shorebirds that breed here in North America. And as Jocelyn mentioned, their populations are declining more rapidly than nearly any other group of species on the planet. As this graph shows you right here, if you follow that red line, you can see that their populations have declined as a group by more than 50% since 1975. And unfortunately, Whimbrel are leading the way nearly. Their populations have declined by an estimated 78% over that period of time. And we also know, though, that although shorebirds are declining more rapidly than other species, that they are not alone, and that we're in fact facing a biodiversity crisis at the moment. So what is it that we can do about that? How can we turn that tide? And I think what we actually need to do is to start by asking some really simple questions that will help us get to the heart of why it is that species are declining in the first place, so that we can then identify what is truly possible to do on the ground to turn it around. And those two questions are deceptively simple. The first one is, what is it that allows some species to respond to environmental change? And that's because, in fact, not all species are currently declining. What is it about those species that makes them resilient to all of the changes that are occurring in the world right now? And by answering that question, we can then illuminate a second question, which is what makes others vulnerable to declines and extinctions? And for my money, I think that to answer these two questions, we need to approach our science by trying to connect the lives of individual organisms, in this case, migratory birds, to those of entire populations of migratory birds, and ultimately to entire species of migratory species across their entire range. And to do that, and to follow the lives of those individual birds, where I think we need to start is by tracking them, tracking their movements using miniaturized devices like transmitters or geolocation loggers. And those can give us an incredible amount of information about the movements of birds on a day-to-day basis, sometimes even a minute-to-minute basis, that we can then place in a broader environmental context that tells us exactly what's going on in the world around them. So in my lab, we try to do that by being on the ground in as many places that our birds touch down as possible, so that we can do things like monitor resource availability and abundance. How much food is there for these birds as they're touching down? We also try to follow as many individuals of the species we study as possible. So transmitters are unfortunately quite expensive, so we also often just use simple things like plastic leg flags. And these can help us figure out where and when individuals die and how successfully they're able to reproduce. At bigger and broader scales, we also couple our tracking data with remote sensing data so that we can have truly global data sets about what is going on in the world. And then finally, we try to team up with community scientists so that we can develop estimates of population size and population trend over time. And all of this then comes together to point us towards on-the-ground conservation actions. And what I want to do today is I want to first start out by sharing with you a few vignettes about how my lab uses tracking data in order to get to the point where we can make those actionable conservation decisions. And over the past 6 years, my lab has tracked 10 species of shorebirds, fully covering the Western Hemisphere, hundreds of individuals from across these species. And as I said, I'm going to give you 3 vignettes. And those vignettes are first going to talk about how we can use tracking data to think about hemispheric scale processes that influence the lives of birds, and then how regional scale processes influence birds, and finally, how really local scale ones do as well. So to introduce you to this idea of hemispheric scale processes influencing the lives of individual birds, I want to turn to the Hudsonian godwits that Jocelyn mentioned. They are truly my heart and soul, and I think they're the coolest bird out there. So as you can see from these tracks, they're connecting the Arctic of Alaska with the very southern tip of South America. And along the way, during their migrations, they're flying over 10,000 kilometers, 7 days without stopping, flapping the whole way, no food, no water, and so far as we know, no sleep. And the work on Hudsonian godwits in my lab is currently being led by PhD student Jennifer Linscott. And what Jenny has found is how hemispheric scale weather patterns can really influence where it is that godwits are actually able to fly and where it is that they're able to stop. And we can see that really clearly if we look at this map here. This is the migration tracks of a single individual godwit, female KCL, over the course of 3 consecutive years. And so each of those colored lines represents KCL's northward migration during a particular year. And you can see that as she's crossing the Pacific Basin, she first starts out in a very narrow corridor, and then as winds push and pull her, she begins to spread out and show variability in her migration path from year to year. But then as she reaches North America, her path converges again. And especially as she hits the prairie pothole region, it's a very narrow band of territory that she's flying over repeatedly. But what's interesting is that within the prairie pothole region itself, she is not choosing to stop in the same place each and every year. So we again see those colored lines representing the northward migration. And these clusters of dots are where KCL stopped in a particular year. And you can see here that she stopped in a different place each time. And that's because Hudsonian godwits, by and large, use ephemeral agricultural wetlands for their stopover sites. And those ephemeral wetlands are really small, in some cases, maybe a few tens of meters in size. And what that means is that from year to year, and even within a year, they're not necessarily staying on the ground. And so a Hudsonian godwit can't necessarily hope to find the same stopover site in the same place across years. What that means, though, is that godwits are really vulnerable to processes, variation in snowfall and rainfall that influence how much water is actually on the ground. And so between wet and dry years, we can see a 200-fold change in the number of wetlands that are actually available for godwits to stop at. What does that then mean for a godwit trying to find a wetland? Well, let's look at what KCL's tracks show us. So this is a single migration pathway for KCL, and she starts out here in the south where this blue circle is. And keep in mind that up to this point, KCL has not stopped since she left Chiloé Island, 10,000 some kilometers in the past. And she comes to this area and she flies northward till about right here, where it looks like she expects to find some adequate habitat to stop. But apparently it's not what she was hoping for. And so from there, she proceeds to fly in this circle that adds an additional 65 or more kilometers onto her flight, in addition to those 10,000 plus that she's just flown, before she finally finds this stopover site over here. Now, I like to run marathons, and if you told me at the end of the marathon that I needed to add 2 more miles before I finally got to drink some water, I would not be in a very good spot. And I don't think that KCL likely was either. And so unfortunately, we see that between wet and dry years, there's a full 25% difference in the proportion of godwits that are actually surviving their northward migration. And that's a really huge shift. And unfortunately, one that predicts that as future variation in rainfall continues, godwit populations may be further destabilized. Okay, so that's this really big scale, hemispheric scale changes in wind. How can tracking data help us to think about more regional scale processes? For that, I want to turn to the Whimbrel that I already introduced to you and to work that my PhD student, Mena Handmaker, has been leading down in DeVoe Bank. And Whimbrel are as different from godwits as shorebirds can be. Where godwits are finding new places each and every year to go to, Whimbrel know what they like and they think that they know where to find it. And so they keep going back there. So if we zoom in on this region around DeVoe Bank, this is what the tracks of a single Whimbrel look like. We see DeVoe Bank there with a triangle. That's where it spends each night sleeping. And then we see those purple lines, right, leading back to the exact same patch of coastal salt marsh. And so each and every day that Whimbrel is making that trek. And when we first saw this tracking data, we're like, oh, we got it. Okay, we need to save DeVoe Bank and we need to protect this patch of salt marsh. It's going to be where Whimbrel are. But then, of course, we decided maybe we should track some more Whimbrel. And here's what happened when we finally started to get a bigger sample size. We found that Whimbrel are not just using that one particular patch of salt marsh. In fact, they're spreading out across a huge swath of the South Carolina coastline, but also that each individual whimbrel is defending its own foraging territory. So that means that whimbrel are at incredibly low densities across this huge area. So that really changes our prioritization for how we go about trying to protect whimbrel during this period of northward migration. On the one hand, we need to really try to preserve DeVoe Bank, this tiny sandbar. And on the other hand, we need to preserve huge swaths of salt marsh across the entire state. Okay, so that's regional scale. One last short vignette about how we think about the local scale. For this, I want to turn to one other shorebird species. This is the red knot, not the Rufa red knot that you all have done so much to help protect here along the Atlantic coast, but the Roselari subspecies that spends its non-breeding season in Northwest Mexico and breeds in Northwest Alaska and far Eastern Siberia. And the work on red knots in my lab has been led by Julian Garcia Walter, a PhD student who also works at an NGO in Northwest Mexico called Pro Natura Noreste. And Julian and his partners at Pro Natura have been working for the past decade or more at a spot called Guerrero Negro, which is on the outer half of the Baja California Peninsula. And Guerrero Negro is a truly special place hosting more than 300,000 waterbirds of 36 species. And Julian has been lucky enough to be able to put tracking devices on red knots at Guerrero Negro that give us information about their movements every 15 minutes. And because we get so many estimates of where those birds are in space and time, he's been able to then categorize what they were doing at each of those points in time. So this map here shows you 3 different colors for the movements of a single red knot around Guerrero Negro. Those red dots are where Julian believes that this red knot was spending time roosting. The orangey yellow dots are where it was foraging, and the blue dots are where it was just commuting in between those foraging and roosting sites. Julian's then been able to turn this sort of behavioral classification into something that he could couple with projections of future sea level rise to understand how red knots are going to lose those habitats where they spend those different activities. So how they might lose foraging habitats and roosting habitats as well. And unfortunately, the story is pretty grim. What you see first here is a map of Guerrero Negro that basically has 2 colors you need to pay attention to. There's the dark blue that's really deep water, and then there's light blue, and that is water that only since present times is projected to rise above 5 centimeters. And 5 centimeters is actually too much water for a red knot to use while it's foraging. Because if you've actually been out watching red knots, you notice that unlike a lot of other shorebirds, their legs aren't too long. So that 5 centimeters is too deep and would keep them from using that area. By 2100, Julian projects that they're going to have lost 63% of their foraging habitat in Guerrero Negro alone. The story at high tide is unfortunately even worse, and Julian projects that by 2100, red knots will have lost 98% of all of their roosting habitat in Guerrero Negro, meaning that they're going to have to fly outside of the lagoon area itself in order to find a safe place to roost. Julian has then turned these projections into ones that cover the entire non-breeding range of red knots across Northwest Mexico. And in this map here, what you see are in green colors, those areas that might become more suitable as the sea level rises, but in those red colors, places that red knots are going to lose. And Julian projects that by 2100, red knots are going to have lost 55% of all of their habitat across Northwest Mexico. So that's sort of a downer point, but what I think it shows you is that we can turn this information about really individual level processes, what single birds are doing, into a really deep and nuanced understanding of what entire populations are doing. So how do we then connect it to the species level? Well, for that, I want to tell you about some work that I've been carrying out since 2010 with colleagues in South America, Fernando Angulo and Geraldo Norambuena. And along with Fernando and Geraldo and their organizations Corbidi in Peru and the ROC in Chile, we have been surveying the entire coast of southern South America every 4 to 5 years for shorebirds. And in 2024, this work was led by my postdoc, Fernando Faria, along with a suite of organizations in other countries in South America. And we covered the entire area from the Ecuadorian coast with Colombia, around Tierra del Fuego, and up into central Brazil. And what all of that work allows us to do is to create robust population estimates for the entire suite of shorebirds that occupy this area. So Fernando has figured out that in southern South America, there are about 165,000 Magellanic oyster catchers, which are a neotropical breeding shorebird species, and only in at least the areas that we covered, about 6,500 red knots. And since we've been carrying out these surveys since 2010, we're also in the process of developing trend estimates for each of these species across the region. So with this combination of individual and population species level data, then we can really identify what are targeted conservation actions that we think will have important impacts. And so in recent years, we've been working with to think about how we can keep water on the landscape in the prairie pothole region by partnering with farmers and wild waterfowl protection area managers in order to ensure that there are stopover habitat for godwits during dry years. In South Carolina, we've been working to protect barrier islands like DeVoe Bank for whimbrel and other migratory shorebirds. And then in Northwest Mexico, we are starting to build artificial floating roosts that can provide roosting habitat for red knots and other species on high tides that otherwise would cover all of their normally available roosting habitat. But I want to key in here on what we've been doing in South Carolina a little bit more, because I think it speaks to the other part of the process of conservation, and that is outreach and encouraging political action. So we've been lucky enough in our South Carolina work to be partnering with the South Carolina Department of Natural Resources, as well as the multimedia group at the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. And those folks at Cornell were able to get us a spot on the television show CBS Sunday Morning a couple of years ago. They were able to encourage an op-ed in the New York Times. And most importantly, though, they were able to get spots for us in 2 magazines that are read by a whole lot of people in South Carolina, Garden and Gun and Charleston Magazine. And those 2 magazines and the pieces that they ran about DeVoe Bank and whimbrel conservation were really key, because what they did was they showed to people in South Carolina just how spectacular a place DeVoe Bank is, but also how threatened it was by overuse by people on wanting to be on the beach, especially during the critical period of May. And so with all of this sort of upwelling of support and interest, we actually got traction this past spring, and a Republican senator from the mainland of South Carolina, just adjacent to DeVoe Bank, put forward an initiative that set aside DeVoe Bank so that it is no longer open to any people during the shorebird migratory period. And he actually went even further than that, and he included in that protection all of the other barrier islands owned by the state of South Carolina, hopefully meaning that some other barrier islands could soon serve as roost sites for whimbrel as well. That action then in turn brought along the communities that surround DeVoe Bank, and they came together and agreed to become part of the Western Hemisphere Shorebird Reserve Network, which has since recognized DeVoe Bank as a site of global importance. And that's really critical, because even though WISRN designation doesn't actually protect its site itself, what it does involve is the promise by each of the communities that have signed on to withhold the ecological integrity of that site. So we hope that there's now a groundwork for further shorebird conservation actions in the area surrounding DeVoe in the future. So this brings me to my time here as the Bertrand Chair at Mass Audubon. And to think about what it is that I'd like to do, I first want to point out a glaring omission in this map of all of the tracking work that my lab has done in the past few years. If you look closely, you'll notice that we have not tracked a single bird from here in Massachusetts. In fact, I think there are only 3 of the birds that we have tracked that have flown over Massachusetts at some point during the year. And I really want to change that. And I think that there's some obvious candidates for us to start our work with. The first is actually whimbrel, which I've told you quite a bit about, but the second is willet. Why is that? Well, it's because those two species co-occur throughout nearly the entire year. This is a photo showing them together in some salt marsh. And if you were to look at their distributional maps during their non-breeding seasons in South America, I really think that you would have a hard time telling which of these maps corresponds to which of those two species because they co-occur together all the time. So in fact, the whimbrel distributional map is there on the left, the willet on the right. And it's not just though that they co-occur all the time, it's that while they co-occur, their populations are heading in dramatically different directions. I already told you that whimbrel are unfortunately declining at an incredibly rapid rate, 78% since 1975. Willet, though, are the only species of long-distance migratory shorebird whose population has actually increased during that period, 15%. That's pretty remarkable, especially given, as I said, how frequently the two species co-occur. And what's more, I think willet are even more remarkable because they were in fact extirpated from Massachusetts in the early part of the 20th century. And that's shocking to me because I've been to at least a few of the great Mass Audubon coastal sanctuaries, and pretty much each and every one of them that I've been to during the summer months, I've witnessed a sight like this, which is a willet screaming its head off at me, telling me I'm probably just a little too close to either its nest or chicks. But it really was not that long ago that willet were a rare sight during the summer months here. During the first Mass Audubon breeding bird atlas in the mid-1970s, there were only 4 atlas blocks in which willet were thought to be breeding. When that breeding bird atlas was redone from 2007 to 2011, there were 98 blocks in which willet were thought to be breeding. That's a remarkable comeback and suggests that this is a species that is truly resilient to a lot of the changes that are happening in our coastal ecosystems right now. So what is it that allows willet to be resilient while whimbrel are unfortunately so vulnerable? So we're going to try to start working at Mass Audubon sanctuaries this coming summer to track both willet and whimbrel to try to disentail their divergent trends. And we know that there are threats that are looming near in the future that may change the situation for willet as well. And so we need to get a leg up on them. So we're going to be thinking about their responses to things like sea level rise, anthropogenic disturbance, and of course, actual coastal habitat loss. So that's the first thing that we want to undertake. And in fact, I was able to just accept a new graduate student, Laura Torrezon, who is going to come on board to my lab starting in the summer to take on this project. But you might be asking yourself, is Mass Audubon more than just shorebirds? I mean, I'd be happy if it was just shorebirds, but I think there are other things that Mass Audubon has been working on for quite a long time and that are really important in their own right. And one of those is the iconic species on the Mass Audubon logo, and that is the roseate tern. So my predecessor here as the Bertrand chair, Joan Walsh, started a project on Great Gull Island studying roseate terns a very long time ago. And along with Mass Audubon Bird Conservation Director John Herbert, she and a whole team of people have recently begun to track their movements, not only from Great Gull Island, but with the help of Rafael from the coast of Brazil as well. And it's a really critical time to be understanding what roseate terns do during their lives when they're not on land where we can see them, because you might know that offshore wind is a looming reality for us in our quest to make energy production more, at least less reliant on fossil fuels. So these right here are the movements of 5 roseate terns that were tracked from Great Gull Island starting in 2023. And you'll notice there that gray blob down in the lower right-hand corner of the map. And that is a patchwork of both current and future offshore wind development. And so we want to know exactly how terns are moving across the ocean before those areas are developed and as well once they are developed, because it's not just going to be this area here off of Martha's Vineyard in Nantucket that is prone to offshore wind development. And we don't currently know how roseate terns will respond. What we do know is that some other tern species respond quite strongly. So this is a study from sandwich terns breeding in the Netherlands, and they found that after offshore wind farms were erected, that terns started avoiding those areas about 54% of the time. What's more is that the variation in the amount that they avoided the area was really driven by how densely packed the wind turbines were within the farm, with more densely packed turbines leading to a 77% avoidance. So if this is the case for roseate terns, that's a really consequential thing, because roseate terns are an endangered species, and our government has signed on to trying to reestablish their populations. And so we could potentially have a really strong conflict between our offshore wind needs and the needs of roseate terns. And it's not just here in Massachusetts that this is an issue. This is a map of current and potential future offshore wind development across the mid-Atlantic coast. And this is exactly the area where terns are migrating along on their way to South America, where they spend the winter. And potentially, unfortunately, the coast of Brazil, where most of our roseate terns go for the winter, is similarly likely going to be developed strongly for offshore wind in the near future. And so our partners in Brazil from the state of Rio Grande do Norte have been trying to track roseate terns there to map their movements onto those future offshore wind areas. And what they have found, as you can see in this little map here on the right, is that terns on their way to those yellow dots, which is where they forage, are commuting straight through the proposed offshore wind areas. So what we're going to do with the grant we just got from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is to put together what's called a population viability analysis, which will synthesize all of this tracking data, as well as all of the breeding data that Joan and others have collected from Great Gull Island, to try to project out into the future what is going to happen to the population as all of these potential changes might start to take place. So we can imagine that by looking at a simple graph here, where on the horizontal x-axis we have time, and on the vertical y-axis we have population size. And we can play out scenarios where we maybe don't have any offshore wind, or maybe we have a few offshore wind areas that are added and the birds are sort of able to respond over time. Or maybe we have really large-scale offshore wind development that has really negative impacts on the population. So then we can put some bounds on the likelihoods of all of these scenarios playing out, and hopefully help the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in their permitting process for these offshore wind developments. So that is a bit about my scientific vision for Mass Audubon, but it's one that hopefully will continue to evolve in the future and take on other iconic species that Mass Audubon has been working with for many years, such as bobolink, wood thrush, and everybody's favorite little guy, the piping plover. But then there's one other aspect that I want to talk about, and that's the other side of this story, which is how do we tell the story of birds and bird science and bird tracking? And I think Mass Audubon is really well set up to do that, because it's actually a gaping hole, I think, in the bird conservation world, is aggregating movement data and then helping people to understand what that data means. And to me, all of those movement tracks are stories just waiting to be told. And there's so many really cool platforms for doing it. So for instance, Maina Handmaker from my lab recently created what's called a story map for Esri that won an award, and it told the story of 3 whimbrels that she was able to track across their trans-hemispheric movements. So I think Mass Audubon, with the interest of all of you and its amazing team of people, is really well suited to begin to become a leader in telling the stories of migratory birds through tracking data. So then, just to wrap up, quick summary. I want you to know that the drivers of migratory bird declines remain really unclear, but I think that we can start to tackle those declines and understand what's driving them by trying to link individual level processes with species level dynamics. And my goal as the Bertrand Chair is to try to ensure that Mass Audubon's activities are directed at the most critical places and times for Massachusetts birds, whether those are actually occurring in Massachusetts or elsewhere during the rest of their annual cycle. And finally, I think that Mass Audubon can become a global leader in bird tracking for both science and outreach, and that will be a critical piece in actually putting forward a conservation agenda that people can buy into. And with that, I want to thank many funders, but especially all of the PhD students and postdocs in my lab. They are really the people that make all of this work possible, and they're doing an amazing job. Also want to acknowledge all of the great network of collaborators that I have across the Western Hemisphere who help us to be on the ground in all of the places that the birds are spending time. And with that, I'd love to take any questions. Thank you very much.
Amazing. Thank you, Nate. Thank you so much for inspiring us and really bringing us into such an amazing body of work, including some conservation solutions that you and your team are bringing to our broader community. We're really looking forward to working with you and your team and kicking off soon with a focus on those noisy salt marsh friends of ours, the willets, and of course our very dear roseate terns. So we're really looking forward to bringing to all of you who are here tonight to coming back to you with progress and learnings through that research, which, as you heard from Nate, he's already brought on some capacity and leadership on his team to get that work moving. I do want to make a pivot here so that we can ask Nate a handful of questions, some of which were sent to us in advance of this session from you, and some of which are have come in and are coming in now. Before I do that, I do want to send regards, and I was remiss in not doing this when I kicked us off. I want to send regards from our President and CEO, David O'Neill, who was hoping to be here this evening. He was pulled into the State of the State address, an invitation from our Secretary of Energy Environment. So he was called upon to go to the State House and is really sorry not to be here with this great event this evening, but sends his regards. With that, let me turn to some great questions. So, Nate, you have talked some about technology in your research, that which you use. What are you seeing as sort of advances, and how do you think that might change, and how are you looking at how that might change your work and your research in the migratory bird work?
Yeah, I mean, as with all walks of life right now, like technology is just exploding. And it's exciting because it means, right, that there's so many more tools at our fingertips and potentially so much more data that can come in. But I think that for me, though, what's really important to think about is not actually getting lost in that technology, because I think we need to retain ties to the on the ground sort of love of birds and knowledge about birds that can't be gotten through any technological innovation. So I think we really need to look for ways to wed them together so that we generate that knowledge that allows us to contextualize what the technology is helping us to see. But that aside, I mean, there's incredibly cool work going on with monitoring, for instance, nocturnal flight calls of the songbirds that go overhead that allow us to sort of understand the social dynamics of those birds that are otherwise invisible to us. Radar is likewise telling us where birds are moving and how many are moving in ways that we just couldn't tell before. And then these tracking devices that I've been telling you about, they have all sorts of new bells and whistles. Some of them have like accelerometers on them so that we can see like whether a bird is pecking or how fast it's flapping. And all of that really helps us to infer about the behaviors that they might be exhibiting in these places that we just otherwise couldn't get to. So yeah, there's just so many cool things that are coming on board, but I really do think it needs to be grounded in us actually being out there watching birds and knowing about them.
Yeah, such a good message as far as that balance, and of course with Mass Audubon wanting to make sure we're all staying connected, right, to nature and the things that we love, and taking advantage of the things that help us learn the most. So, love that answer. A question about willets in particular. Any hypotheses as to why they might be doing so well?
Yeah, my my sort of pet personal hypothesis is that because they sort of seem like jerks, I think they may actually be jerks, and that they're more resilient to all of our disturbances in ways that other species like Whimbrel maybe aren't. So I think one of the first things that we really want to understand is how Willet may be able to use sites that are really highly disturbed, especially small pockets of habitat that Wimbrel just can't spend time in. And, it's not just that maybe Willets are jerks. I'm, of course, anthropomorphizing there. It's also that Wimbrel are a lot bigger than Willet. And so they have a slower takeoff time. So if you imagine a dog going after a group of shorebirds just, to scare them up, it's probably a lot more likely to get a lot closer to a Wimbrel before it's able to take off. And that's not a good thing for a Wimbrel. So that's my personal hunch.
Yeah. And you are mentioning Wimbrel, and I'm thinking about the work that we're doing with Manomet from a Mass Audubon perspective as far as a partnership there. And there was a specific question about Manomet and are you coordinating with them? And I know that you are, and I'd love for you to just share what that looks like with.
Yeah, yeah. So our job is made a lot easier by a lot of the efforts that Manomet is putting forth right now. So they have been trying to track Wimbrel that they've been catching on Cape Cod. So I think that's going to allow us to take the tracking work of the Willet so that we can really pair those two together. And then, in fact, that new graduate student that I mentioned, Laura Torreson, she has been working with Manomet in Brazil, her native Brazil. And so she is going to sort of further solidify that partnership. So, yeah, I think, when you're studying migratory birds, you've got to be working with as many different folks as you can. And so we hope to really work hand in hand with the folks at Manomet.
It's a family we're growing, right? And so the bird conservation universe is lots of partnerships and collaborations, no
Yeah.
doubt. Um, since we're on some specific species questions, or this is maybe specific to the South Carolina DeVoe Bank example, a question on whether the stopover spot there, is it so imprinted for those birds that they can't shift as sea level rises, or right, is that the only, or what's the assumption there?
Yeah, this is the last chapter of my PhD student Maina's dissertation. So I'm eagerly waiting the answer as well. But I'll tell you what it looks like is that she has been tracking the movements of these individual Wimbrel throughout the tide cycle to see whether they're able to sort of dynamically shift their habitat use and what they forage on as the tide cycle changes, in hopes that this will help us to understand as sea level rise shifts, those habitats inland, whether or not they might be able to make use of those new spots. And so she's found that at low tide, they're in low marsh areas and they feed on really small crabs. And so they just gobble up a whole lot of them. At high tide, they're up in the high marsh areas and they focus on these really big crabs. So they're completely shifting the prey species that they feed on depending on the tide cycle. So whether that means they're really able to respond as much as we would, really hope, I don't know. But it does give me a bit of hope that, they are a bit more flexible than we might have sort of just first glance thought from how, tightly tuned those movements seem to be day after day after day.
Yeah, and a related question around how our bird species may need to shift, and really around how it informs us, Mass Audubon and others, around what we're protecting. So a question saying that tracking will obviously help identify critical areas for conservation action that currently exist. Given change, and this is a huge reason why we're excited to work with you, sort of what is the research that's being conducted on potential future areas, or can you comment on that? And of course, that's near and dear to part of why we want to work together. So so thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I think the idea here is that by looking at how much variation these species are encountering in their day-to-day lives right now, we can understand how much flexibility they might be able to have to allow us to provide them new habitats in new places that they'll actually be able to go and find. So if we think about, godwits in the mid-continent, I have every bit of confidence that if we are able to create new wetlands somewhere in that sort of general flyway that the godwits are making use of, they're going to find them and they're going to make use of them. With Wimbrel, it might be a slightly different story where I think we might have to try to sort of maintain the same sort of general region of habitat and just allow those habitats to sort of move slightly in space, and that's sort of the amount of flexibility that they have. Whereas if we tried to tell Wimbrel, oh, you need to go 100 kilometers over there and that's where the salt marsh is going to be now, I think that might be a lot harder. So we really need to understand how they're responding to that variation now to think about how flexible they'll be in the future.
Yeah, that's great. This is a broad question, so take it as you will. Really, the question is, what is the most important issue facing birds at this moment? And in particular, there was a question around the role of window strikes, of cats, which of course is something that we
Yeah.
hear and talk about quite a bit. And of course, this is a giant category. So I'll hand that to you to think through as you will, but I think also maybe addressing there's another question in the chat, particularly around window strikes. So maybe what you can share with us about those particular threats and the other biggies that you think are really driving these populations.
Yeah. So I'm going to do duck this a little bit. I don't think there's any one threat that sort of rules them all. There's no ring that rules them all here. We've got each species is sort of facing a slightly different set of threats. But I would say clearly that habitat change is first and foremost. And so that even comes before things like, global warming and sort of global weirding and that kind of stuff. I think we have just altered so much habitat in so many different ways that is a umbrella probably is a pretty safe bet. And I think that what we need to think about when we're talking about things like bird window strikes and cats is that those are fairly indiscriminate threats, right? We're talking they're killing lots of individuals, but not necessarily a lot of them in one particular spot. And so that means that they're sort of this background, unfortunately, a background threat that's always there, and it's making the rest of our jobs harder. So if we could deal with those, it would make the rest of our jobs easier, but it doesn't change the fact that there are these far more sort of focused threats on particular sites or particular times of the year that can have a really profound effect sort of added on top of those sort of low-level background threats. So bird window strikes, though, is a great example of something we totally know how to solve. And in fact, at UMass Amherst right now, just last week, we submitted a report to our facilities crew detailing the top 6 buildings on campus that kill birds. And in fact, the windows in each of those buildings that kill birds. And we're hoping to convince them to it's probably only going to be about $50,000 to put up bird safe glass in all of those windows. That's totally doable in so many different places. And I think we absolutely need to try to tackle that issue. But it doesn't mean that we shouldn't also be focusing on these more sort of imminent and directed threats that could really wipe out large groups of individuals in one place and time.
Great. I might ask you one final question. I know we're getting a little short on time. Western Hemisphere Shorebird Reserve Network, Massachusetts is lucky to have 2 brilliant sites, so Monomoy, as well as the Great Marsh. So a question is, are either of these significant areas, do you know, on a hemispheric level for migration or for wintering shorebirds? There is a PS here that the person who's asking served on the Montana Audubon board with your Aunt Rachel. So, but
Oh,
thoughts
all
on
right.
what
So
we
that's
have?
going to make it back to my family if I answer this poorly.
Yeah, so the question really around Monomoy and the Great Marsh, which of course are these spectacular and very special places. Any perspectives or thoughts on that?
Yeah, David O'Neill has frequently asked me, what is the DeVoe Bank of Massachusetts? And the answer is we've already discovered it, and it's Monomoy, right? Monomoy is just a cool, cool place that provides that really unique, protected because it's just offshore, right? Place that shorebirds can be shorebirds. And so it's really important throughout basically the entire year, but especially during southbound migration. And one of the things we've been learning as we've been tracking more shorebird species is how many of them are bailing out on Cape Cod because the winds aren't good and they're fueling up there again for that big push the remainder of the way to South America. So Monomoy is absolutely a really critical spot. Great Marsh too. And Great Marsh also has shorebirds really throughout the year. So I know you can go up there and find Dunlin and Sanderlings and some purple sandpipers right now, and that's really crucial stuff too, because yeah, these salt marshes aren't just during migration.
Yeah, that's great. Well, thank you. I want to close up our Q&A session with that last answer. In part, we can all be thinking of those nice summer days out at the Great Marsh and at Monomoy, and here we are in deep winter. But I do want to note a couple of things. First of all, there will be I mentioned earlier, there's a recording of this. We will be sharing a link to that as soon as that recording is ready. I want to say thank you again to you, Nate, for sharing your time with us this evening, for sharing your work. And hopefully all of you listening are not only seeing the opportunity for us to really build and gain together in this collaboration between Dr. Senner's lab and Mass Audubon, and hopefully you all will engage with us and join with us on this journey, which is really exciting, whether at the species level, at the landscape level, at the hemispheric level. There's just an extraordinary amount of work to do. So we love your commitment and your engagement with us. I do want to note as we close out, I want to extend an invitation for everyone to join us on Zoom again in a couple of weeks. Mass Audubon will be having our annual Policy and Conservation Forum. This is Wednesday, January 29th. There's a link, I believe, in the chat button, and we'll also be sending you that link in an email to follow. But I want to thank you all again for joining this evening and for joining me and welcoming Dr. Nate Senner and his team to our Mass Audubon network and circle. So thank you all and good night.
Thank you.